All right, so a couple weeks ago, DJI released a pretty big firmware update on this right here, the DJI Pocket 3. And when it comes down to the version number, as far as when I downloaded the firmware, it is the DJI Pocket 3 V01.06.08.04. So depending on when you're watching this, you might have a newer firmware, but I just want to give you guys a firmware that I'm referencing when I downloaded it and did the update on my Pocket. And in this update, there's about 5 new updates to it. 3 of them are pretty, I'd say, a little bit more important. The other 2 deal with the DJI Mimo app. And there's also an update on here, which actually came out in a previous firmware update that I don't think I've talked about, but I use a lot on the Pocket 3. So I'll talk about that one at the very end. And for this video, I do have 2 Pocket 3s that I'm going to be using, one with the old firmware, one with the new firmware, so you guys can see exact same shots. Everything will be shot in auto, 4K, 30 frames a second. Now the first update we have here is the additional medium telly mode on the Pocket 3, which pretty much allows you to punch in 2 times, gives you about a 40mm equivalent lens, and you ideally shouldn't lose any video quality. Now previously, if you wanted to zoom in or punch in on your video, you would just use the standard digital zoom in on the Pocket 3. You would just click on the menu here on the side, then you would use your joystick here and pretty much just zoom in, but that will be a digital zoom. With the new update, DJI is saying that you can now actually punch in and not lose much quality at all when you go into that telly or that medium telly mode. Now to activate the medium telly mode, all you do is tap on those little 2 arrows here at the very bottom and the video will then punch in 2 times. Now the one thing I did notice is that when I did the firmware update, I wasn't seeing those arrows. Those arrows weren't showing up at the very bottom of my screen. And I was like, wait, did I do everything right? Did I update the firmware correctly? Because it should show up there. The one thing that you cannot do is you cannot shoot in D-Log format and use that medium telly mode, that 40mm equivalent. So once I turned off D-Log and just went back to standard normal mode, the arrows now showed up, so I'm able to now punch in or zoom in with that new feature. Pretty unfortunate that we can't use that feature in D-Log because most of the time I'm shooting in D-Log so I can color match with my DJI Action or my drones. So with the old firmware, you can only do 2 times or zoom in 2 times digitally. Now with the new firmware, you can actually punch in 2 times with that lossless zoom on the new firmware update. But not just that, you can actually still go in 2 times more digitally on the Pocket 3. So here's a couple side-by-side shots that I took just of my son here in the backyard. The first one, of course, is the standard shots. 4K 30, just putting these side by side. It's kind of hard to tell how much of the difference there is between the 2. It's not until you get into the next phase, which is the medium telly, the 40mm equivalent on the new firmware, as well as the digital 2X on the previous firmware, where you can start seeing a little bit of a difference. For this one, I actually kept the focus on the vans because when you start looking at edges and you start looking at kind of fine text, that's where you can really see some of the differences. But once you punch in even further, so now I'm using the medium telly, the new firmware updated 40mm, as well as the 2 times digital zoom on the new firmware update on the Pocket 3. The one thing I did notice with the new firmware update is that when it comes down to skin tones, it does have a little softer feel compared to, I would say, the sharpening that the digital zoom is doing on the previous firmware. Next, we're doing a little test here using text, and as you can see here, wide, you can't really tell too much. It's not till you start zooming in. And on the left, we do have now 2 times digital plus manually zoomed in on my software here. And definitely, if you start looking at the very bottom of the text right below monitor, you can see a lot clearer with the new firmware update on the Pocket 3. Now, besides the D-Log not being able to be used on that telly mode, there are a couple other limitations. You can only go up to 1600 ISO versus 6400 on the previous firmware, as well as active track is not available using that new telly mode. Next feature DJI added is breathing compensation. Now, if you're not familiar with breathing compensation, basically when your camera starts to hunt for focus, you'll see the foreground and background kind of shift in and out. And when that shift happens, you can kind of see sometimes there's a little bit of a movement in the back. It kind of zooms in or out when it's trying to focus on something close to the lens. Now, there's a new option here on the firmware where you can now turn breathing compensation on. Now, the one that I did notice is that there is a tiny little crop in, I would say, on the new firmware. When I'm putting it side by side, it does look like there's a little bit, it's punched in just a little bit more on the updated firmware versus the old one. Now, the one thing that does work is that you are able to use the telly mode with the breathing compensation. So at least they didn't remove that one. You do have that option here. And for those that use the Pocket 3 as a webcam, you are able to do that. All you have to do is plug it into either the very bottom of the Pocket, or if you have the 1/4-20 adapter, you have the USB-C right there. Plug it into the Pocket, plug this into your laptop, and you can now press webcam here on the interface. And if you use the Pocket 3 as a webcam, you can actually turn D-Log on. And the next two features we have as far as updates go are on the DJI Mimo app. You can now download your footage in the background, as well as you can take screenshots and save them as photos and live photos through the Mimo app as well. And like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, there's actually one feature on the Osmo Pocket which came out in a previous update, which I thought was pretty cool. A couple other action cameras are doing that as well. But if you're recording a video, so if you have this on a tripod and you're trying to record, say, your son playing basketball or soccer, and you just have it recording the whole time, and you're like, you know what? Nothing happened. Nothing happened for the last 15, 20 minutes. I don't really want to keep that footage. All you have to do is that when, instead of stopping the recording by pressing the start and stop like you normally would, you just hold down the record button, and then you have the option to now erase that previous clip that you were just recording with. That way you don't have to go back in later, go to preview, delete the footage, and free up some more space. You can just do it right there with that record button. And there it is, guys. Just some new updated features on the DJI Pocket 3. Definitely is one of the best cameras for content creators just on the go. I use this thing all the time at shows, conferences, getting B-roll, just having it as just a pocketable camera, higher quality than action cameras. Not as high quality as some of my Sony cameras, but definitely sits there right in the middle. Hopefully you guys got some value from this video, and if you did, a big like would be much appreciated. This is Alger Stasio with FlytPath.com. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.